50 years ago this week, Robert Kennedy died after being shot in Los Angeles. Here in Boston, Kennedy's legacy was recalled through one trip and one speech he made. A trip to South Africa in 1966 and a speech there to the National Union of Student Africans. Many now hail it as Robert Kennedy's most powerful and eloquent speech. Margaret Marshall, the first woman to serve as the Chief Justice of our Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, is a South African native. And at the time that Kennedy came, she was the vice president of the Student Union when he visited. As a student activist against apartheid, Margie Marshall was part of the group of young people who invited Robert Kennedy and then accompanied him throughout his visit there. As Marshall explained in an interview on WGBH radio this week, universities in South Africa in the 1950s had begun to be required by the apartheid government to be segregated by race. South Africa at that time was completely isolated with the government in control. No television, government censorship of all news, books banned, and of course not yet any internet. The student union decided to invite an international speaker who could bring a message of hope to this closed-off country. They first invited Dr. Martin Luther King, who accepted, but the South African government, not surprisingly, denied him a visa. Next, they decided to invite Robert Kennedy, knowing strategically that it would be much harder to deny a visa to him if Kennedy were to say yes, given the former President Kennedy's past alliance with South Africa. Robert Kennedy did agree to accept the students, but he was not provided any official security. The airport arrival was chaotic, Marshall recalls, with many protesters shouting at him, and in retrospect, it was a tremendous act of bravery that Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy has. A member of the Indian community unexpectedly, in friendship, but unexpectedly, reached from behind Kennedy to throw a welcoming garland over his head. Nobody flinched. Amazingly, Kennedy's first stop was a remote village. Nelson Mandela's predecessor was Albert Luthuli, the first African to win a Nobel Prize, a revered leader of the Black people and a minister and advocate of nonviolence against apartheid. As a powerful opponent of the regime, Chief Luthuli was repeatedly banished by the government to this remote village. He was allowed at the time of Kennedy's appointment to be seen only with one person at a time. No photographs could be taken of him. No quotes from him could be reported. That Kennedy chose to visit Luthuli in order to learn from him was a powerful action. And word spread quickly throughout the Black community that Kennedy had honored their unmistakable leader. By the time Kennedy arrived for his speech to the University of Students in Johannesburg, throngs wanted to attend. Whites only were allowed. He opened this way. There is a country that I want to honor and speak to today. It is a country where the Dutch were first settling, and after some time, the British came and took over. It is a country where the native people were subjugated, and the relations remain poor today. I want to speak about a country where those who were Black were enslaved, and I want to speak about a country where the challenges remain. They have used their technology to do well, but there are problems afoot. I speak, of course, said Kennedy, of the United States. By beginning that way, Robert Kennedy wanted people to know that he would not preach at them from a sense of being superior, that he knew to be credible at all, he had to first honestly acknowledge the history of discrimination at his own home. I think it's always true, isn't it? We become credible advocates for justice when we begin first by looking inward at our own struggles with it and first work on those. Second, Kennedy talked directly to the students that were assembled, affirming for them that they were not alone, that all across the globe, other students were leading efforts towards greater equality, even if they could not be aware of it. In other words, the students of South Africa were part of a much wider worldwide movement against walls of indifference and cruelty. Young leaders such as themselves were providing hope for the future. Kennedy affirmed them. Others were right now treading the same path alongside them. Third, Kennedy specifically named the dangers that still can trip up any of us who try to take stands that are unpopular or threaten the way things have been done before. He names the 4 dangers: futility, expediency, timidity, and comfort. We know them, don't we? That futile feeling that no one person can make any difference. The false claim expediency makes that to accomplish a goal requires giving up your core ideals. The courage that is needed to brave the wrath of society and even the disapproval of your own colleagues. And then the danger of comfort. Quote, the temptation by those of us, privileged with education, to follow the easy and familiar path of personal ambition or financial success. Certainly these dangers are as great today as they were for Kennedy's audience. But what value in clearly naming them so we can identify what we might be stumbling upon, what might hinder us? Kennedy concluded, quote, with a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth and lead the land we love, asking God's blessing and God's help, and knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. We, God's hands. The encouragement which Kennedy offered the South African students that day has reverberated over the last 50 years. Justice Marshall said it guided her life. The words that he said are now on Robert Kennedy's grave. Each time a person stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against any injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. It's the point of today's Bible lesson also, I would say, the one that Dean read us. Jesus himself is out there roiling the waters all around him. We are only in chapter 3 of the Gospel of Mark, but already all the important people of that time are shouting, Jesus has been taken over by the devil. That, or he was mentally ill out of his mind. And what do they cite? Well, Jesus is ignoring the rules that proper people follow. He cures on the Sabbath. Jesus blasphemes by claiming to forgive sins. Jesus spends time with the utterly wrong kind of people. Well, but clearly, sputter his opponents, the only way Jesus could cast out demons is because the demons are cooperating with his healing tricks. Jesus must be in league with the devil himself. Indeed, the maelstrom becomes so loud that even Jesus' nearest and dearest apparently become uncomfortable and set out to admonish him, his family, those from whom he had hoped he would always get support. Jesus' mother, Mary, has heard from well-meaning neighbors, well, you know, Mary, we really like Jesus. He was a nice boy, but don't you think he's gone just a bit too far now? I just wouldn't want him hurt. I would guess that Mary is scolded at the synagogue, too, because he is violating the tradition. Mary, didn't you teach him better? And perhaps, I don't know, but do you think that her old friends now look away when they see her coming, fearful of being tainted themselves by Jesus' infamy? The pressure against those who do something different and against the grain always grows, just as Robert Kennedy described. I am sure that Mary and her other grown children prayed and sought advice before setting out to corral Jesus. I don't think they do it lightly. And they must be convinced that they're in his best interest. They just want to bring him home quietly, protect him from the criticism and threats. After all, Jesus is just one man. What difference will it make from a practical perspective if he steps aside for a while to sort things out? Jesus has two responses. As for working alongside the devil, Jesus says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. You can't steal from the devil's house unless you first tie up the devil. Don't you see? He is trying to tell us it's God who seeks our healing. Works of healing are from God. And as for his family now at the door, Jesus expands the definition of who are his family. They are anyone, any of us who seek God's will. Jesus cannot be governed by what others think of him, not even those he knows care for him. He has to be guided by what he has discerned to be God's will, and oh, that frees him. That single focus liberated Jesus to do the right things regardless of the cost. How do these words and actions of Kennedy and Christ apply to us here at King's Chapel? How do they apply to you today, personally? I offer one answer. As we celebrate our 332nd birthday of King's Chapel, it is an amazing accomplishment. For 332 years, those who have come before us have committed to worshiping God in word and in music. They have committed to serving God by serving others as Jesus taught. They have committed to growing in their spiritual lives and following the path Christ first blazed. Committed, shall we say, to doing God's will. Because fundamentally, that's the only way church can survive in a downtown setting for 332 years. That's how a church can raise funds to build this beautiful building. That's how a church can bravely rise again after the American Revolution, when there were only 12 people here, and courageously adopt our remarkable open theology, the first Unitarian belief in the free conscience of all, no longer requiring a creed, despite the heavy criticism by so many around us. If our forebears did not believe they were doing God's will of bearing light and living love and healing, they would never have been strong enough to carry on all these years. And we know, looking back, that sometimes in the past our forebears' discernment of God's will was wrong, as was the discernment at the time of most American Christians. Our members kept people enslaved and sold children away from their mothers. Our members' very first vote after the building was built was to have those with dark skin sit only in the balcony. Our members would not let women be leaders, not wardens or vestry members, and some of our members left over gay marriage. John Winthrop, who was here and founded this colony long before King's Chapel even existed, he, a man of God who talks about a city on a hill, he writes being convinced that it was God who had willed the native population in nearby villages to die. It was God who willed that the white settlers with guns should slay Native Americans and then enslave them. How do we sometimes get it so wrong? As Kennedy modeled, acknowledging that we've been wrong in the past when we try to stand up for justice today can give us far more credibility. We don't pretend perfection. But what a blessing that we still call God's will the touchstone that we'll always seek. How liberating still to have that standard. An imperfect past does not condemn us today, but it can teach us humility, to be rigorous when we make decisions, to be vigilant, to see where we're running afoul of the dangers that Kennedy cited, those things of feeling change is futile. We must be efficacious and set aside our true values. We are timid and quieted when we run into opposition or that danger of comfort, that we simply go and do what we most easily can do. Amanda Pickett, our co-chair of Community Action Committee, posited that just as slavery must have depleted the humanity of those church people who defended it, what are the actions that we take now that actually deplete us of our humanity? What might we be doing that in the future others will wonder and say, how did King's Chapel countenance that? In my view, the lessons from thinking about slavery convince me that we retain in our core a national belief that those with dark skin are somehow lesser and to be feared. We hear at any time dark-skinned immigrants are labeled subhuman animals. It underlies a cruel policy that strips poor, dark-skinned parents from their poor and traumatized, very young, dark-skinned children in ways I don't think we would allow to happen to whites. It lives on any time dark-skinned people are disproportionately jailed as dangerous, disproportionately violently subdued by law enforcement. It lives on any time we choose the path of comfort for ourselves, keeping our cars and other products that pollute while ignoring the science of climate change that is going to cause poor, dark-skinned people to suffer first from both rising tides and drought. On what issues might we be deemed culpable by future generations, wondering why we couldn't discern God's clear will? Well, immigration and racism and climate change are strong candidates. But my friends, I am confident that together we'll discern how we, in this season, are called by God. We've been doing that over time at this church, widening our welcome, broadening the list of those who can vote, expanding our process for joining, welcoming a woman to the pulpit, and opening the doors to all who seek marriage here. Despite opposition, the waves of change initiated by individuals here have grown. Other ripples have joined other ripples, and barriers have fallen. So today we rejoice in the remarkable legacy we have at King's Chapel, for so much to be grateful for and much from which we can keep learning. And we also have the conviction, the hope, that we are not alone. Like the students in South Africa, we know that we're part of a bigger movement, what we call the people of God, of goodwill, of light and love across religions and across the globe. And together, our little ripples will bring down barriers and hatreds. We will keep working on that in our 303rd year here on this corner. Alleluia. Amen.